The Jagdtiger, or hunting tiger, or officially designated the Panzerjäger Tiger Aus of B, was the last and largest armoured fighting vehicle that the Germans would produce en masse during the war. This vehicle has come to gain the reputation of being the heaviest armoured fighting vehicle used by any nation during the Second World War, and the heaviest combat vehicle of any type to be produced during the conflict. Briefly breaking over the design theory, the Germans had decided that they were going to continue mounting heavy guns to the chassis of existing tanks which they were deeming obsolete or getting out of service, and would put them along the two lines of theory, the assault gun theory and the tank destroyer theories. Now, we've covered some of the examples of the tank destroyer line. We've had a look at the Marders and the Nashorn being ideal and very good examples of this. The Ferdinand is basically sort of a mix between the self-propelled gun, assault gun, tank destroyer kind of concept. We are yet to look at things like the Sturmgeschütz and the Jagdpanzers and the Jagdpanther. The Jagdtiger serves as the last, biggest, and most ridiculous example of such design theories. The reason why the Germans had decided to utilise this theory was because German tank destroyers during the Second World War have casemates. Now, a casemate is basically a fully enclosed armoured fighting compartment. This means that no turret is required. This allows the design to be simplified. It allows the cost and weight and materials necessary to actually build the vehicles to be considerably lowered, as it's not really a requirement anymore to try and fit a turret on top. You can literally build the casemate around the gun if you need to. So in early 1942, a request is made by the German Army General Staff to mount a 128mm self-propelled armoured chassis. Sorry, I meant to say that's a 128mm gun onto a self-propelled chassis. Okay, the gun in question that they would use is the 128mm Pak 44 gun. This gun is, quite frankly, ridiculous. The main role of the Pak 44 was designed to counter really heavy Soviet tanks like the IS-2. A thing which the gun never actually needed to be built, but at this point the Germans are building bigger and bigger weapons because they feel that that's the only way they can sort of stay ahead in the armory versus armour contests that is going on. For the 128mm gun, design contracts are awarded to Rheinmetall, Borsig and Krupp, with the Krupp design ultimately being picked. Rheinmetall had developed a 128mm flat gun, but Krupp basically went from the ground up. So while Rheinmetall Borsig basically did what had been done for the Tiger 1, taking the Flak 18 and then basically mounting it on a tank chassis, Krupp basically built this gun from the ground up. And it is very, very obvious to see that they've done that. This thing weighs 11 tons. It is ridiculous. It is massively overweight. This thing has no purpose being an army service. It shouldn't have been an army service. It should never even been considered for army service. But it is. The fact of the matter is, however, that only 50 barrels and breeches are actually built for these guns, and they're mounted on ex-French heavy gun chassis, or heavy gun carriages, because they're just so heavy. they're just ridiculous. There's no other chassis or other carriage mount the Germans have got that can mount them. By 1943, it's obviously envisioned that they're going to put these things onto a mounted tank chassis because they're just too heavy to be used in army service. In tank service, they'll be known as the 12.8cm Pak 80 gun. Now, the performance of the gun is absolutely phenomenal, okay? Let's not kid ourselves. Yeah, this thing's ridiculously heavy. Yeah, it's stupidly impractical. But the weapon itself is something different. Using a two-piece ammunition, this means that the gun basically has to be loaded as two separate parts. You have the actual ammunition, which goes in the gun, and then you have the actual blasting propellant, which goes in just afterwards. You see this in a lot of modern artillery weapons. they normally load the actual the shell itself and then put the propellant charge in afterwards. This both simplifies the process and means that the shell itself can have more put into the actual performance of the weapon rather than having to worry about having its own propellant put in with it. The Germans have 3 propellant charges for the vehicle. They have a light, a medium and a heavy charge. The light and medium charges are normally used when the gun is fulfilling the role of an artillery piece. Yes, this thing is intended to be used as basically point-blank artillery, where it would launch a 28 kilogram high explosive projectile, whilst the heavy charge was used to fire the 28.3 kilogram APCBE HE projectile. Basically, that translated to armor-piercing cap, ballistic capped, high explosive projectile, also more simply referred to as Panzergranaten 43. When being fired with the heavy charge, this ammunition had a muzzle velocity of 950 meters a second, which is very respectable for a gun and an ammunition of that weight. The Pak 44 was capable of penetrating 312 millimeters of armor at a 30-degree slope at 500 meters. That's 12.3 inches for the record. At 500 meters, this goes out to 9.1 inches. Sorry, 1,000 meters that is. At 2,000 meters, that goes out to 7.9 inches, and at 3,000 meters, it can penetrate 6.8 inches. Just to put this in some context, this thing could be nearly 4,000 meters out and would still punch through a Sherman's armor like it was butter. It's a ridiculous weapon. Briefly coming back from that, however, by early 1943, the decision to install this gun has pretty much been sounded off on. You know, they're all happy with it. And they want to mount it on either a Panther or a Tiger I chassis in the form of a heavy assault tank. The Panther chassis is considered unsuitable after a wooden mock-up of the design is shown to just be completely impractical. The chassis won't do it. There's also some bits floating around about how they didn't want to take away from existing production, because obviously you've got the Panther, you've got the Jagdpanther, you don't want to draw away from anything else just so you could stick a slightly bigger gun in there. The Tiger I chassis is rejected mainly because because production of the Tiger I is ending. Tiger I production is pretty much coming to an end. They don't want to start building a new vehicle on the Tiger I chassis only for it to not get used. On the 20th of August 1943, a wooden mock-up of a weapon mounted on the Tiger II heavy tank chassis is presented to Hitler in East Prussia. 2 prototypes will be produced from this variant. Okay, they accept it, they sort of sign off on it. You know, they looked happy. The 2 prototypes vary only by their suspension. One is an 8 road wheel Porsche suspension system, they go under serial number 305001, and the other version is a Henschel 9 overlapping road wheel suspension system, serial number 305002. That's important because whenever we look at Jagdtigers, the difference between the two can quite literally be made out just by the suspension alone. As it was going to use the main production of Tiger IIs as its basis, which were being constructed by Henschel, the idea was that the 8 road wheel design would be used for a couple, and then they would go straight onto the Henschel manufacturing. It was originally envisioned that the first real models would be coming out of the line by February 1944. That was the hope. The vehicle was officially signed off, being designated initially as the Jagdpanzer VI, but was then later renamed to the Jagdtiger and received the designation of SDKFZ 186 as its infantry ordnance number. It is important to also note that there were attempts to mount the long-barreled 88mm gun inside the Jagdtiger, a mock-up of which was complete, but it never went into production. This was done because they lacked the number of 128mm they needed to actually complete the order that had been made. The design of the Jagdtiger breaks with virtually every traditional idea we have around Jagdpanzer design. This thing is huge. It is enormous. Yes, the Jagdpanther was big, and yes, the Ferdinand was big, but this thing is big. Unlike the Jagdpanther, the Jagdtiger's casemate design did not extend the glazier's plate upwards in one piece. You look at the Jagdpanzer's, you look at like the Jagdpanther. The Jagdpanther is all one single plate that comprises the frontal armor. The Jagdtiger is not. The Jagdtiger the front plate goes up where the initial Tiger 2 hull armor is meant to be. Then there's a flat bit, and then it goes straight up for where the casemate is. This is... many people might worry that this will really sort of make it vulnerable to anti-tank guns, but it was a requirement for fitting such a massive weapon inside. So the separate superstructure which is eventually mounted is enormous and is very, very heavily armoured. The tank itself has 250 millimeters of armour on the front of the casemate and 150 millimeters on the front of the glazier's plate. For the record, that is 9.8 inches and 5.9 inches of armour respectively. There are not many vehicles in the entire Allied inventory that could punch through this armour. You get this thing hulled down, you're pretty much invulnerable. The main gun mount only had a limited traverse of about 10 degrees. The entire vehicle would have to be turned to aim outside a very narrow field of fire. This was one of the Jagdtiger's biggest problems. You had to constantly shift the vehicle in order to get the gun lined up, and the vehicle was very, very, very heavy. So the Jagdtiger suffered from a variety of mechanical and technical problems due to the immense weight and the underpowered engine. The more we move into Tigers, the more we'll just talk about the engine being constantly underperforming. It's a thing which happens throughout the Tiger's life. The vehicles would suffer from frequent breakdowns, and ultimately more were lost to mechanical problems or lack of fuel than to enemy action. A lot of them would end up just being destroyed by their own crews. By the end of the design process, the vehicle we got is something beyond ridiculous. The vehicle itself weighs 71.7 tons. This is the Henschel suspension, by the way. So 71.7 tons. It has an overall length of 10.65 meters, or 34 feet 11 inches, a width of 3.6 meters, or 11 foot 10 inches, and a height of 2.8 meters, which is 9 foot and 2 inches. That is a height that would impress a Sherman. The crew was 6: 1 commander, 1 gunner, a loader, an assistant loader, a driver, and an assistant driver. The 2 loaders were primarily needed for the two-part ammunition. Armour, as we discussed previously, was 250mm thick on the front of the casemate, which made this thing virtually invulnerable to frontal attack. The front of the hull had 150mm of armour, while the sides and rear both had 80mm. Main armament was a single 128mm Pak 44 L55, known as the Pak 80 in Panzer service. The secondary armament was comprised of a single 7.90mm MG34, which was mounted in the hull, and some later vehicles were built with an MG42 mounted over the engine deck. The engine was the V12 Maybach HL230 P37PS engine. This is the engine which I will talk about. It's the engine which powers all the Tigers. It's big, it's slow, it's ponderous, it's underpowered. It should never have been mounted on a vehicle of this size. So the suspension is obviously a torsion bar suspension. This remains the same regardless of whichever design you look at. In total, the fuel capacity was 860 litres, which gave it an operational range on road of 120 kilometres or 75 miles, and off-road 80 kilometres or 50 miles. The maximum speed was 34 kilometres an hour or 21 miles an hour. However, I do not think if you're a Tiger or a Jagdtiger commander, you are going to run the tank at that speed. You will flipping break down all the time. Construction of the vehicle is something up in the air. 150 Jagdtigers are initially ordered, but between 70 and 85 are produced. The closest definitive number I have is 77, produced from July 1944 to March of 1945. Though some claim that the vehicles had even more built up until the end of the war, I've never been able to find a definitive stat. The initial series order for 150 was issued in 1944 that stipulated that these were to be completed, hopefully sometime before mid-1945. This, however, is reversed in January 1945 with an order to continue the assembly of the Jagdtiger as fast as possible. The delay is initially put on because they don't want to interrupt Panther production. However, this is then completely reversed and turned over as there was a right, build as many of them as we can. Bang, let's go. 11 of them are the serial number 305001. These were the Porsche suspension. Okay? So these are the ones with 8 road wheels per side, slightly shorter hull. So the first 11 are of a Porsche design. Everything else after that is built by Henschel. They are produced at the Nürburgwerk plants at St. Valentin, which is based in Austria. Production here begins in July of 1944, with vehicles largely taken from Tiger II production. Sometimes they get damaged ones that they just repair and put back into service, but towards the end of the war this becomes less and less possible. The important parts such as the superstructure and drive wheels are supplied by the Einswerk Oberdono, which is based in southern Germany. Details of the production locations are known to the Allies virtually as soon as they go into production. The priest Heinrich Meyer, who was an Austrian anti-Nazi, pretty much gives away the location of these vehicles, and they get bombed mercilessly. So production will continue towards the end of the war. The biggest stats we've got regarding production history, production history is completely up in the air. You have sources that date it as early as February they begin producing them. You have July that's thrown in there. Production apparently stops in March, and then it starts again, and then there's production in May. For all we know for definite is that December 1944 is when the most of them are produced, which is 20 vehicles. After September of 1944, no Zimmer anti-magnetic paste was factory applied. This is important because this is the sort of thing that basically prevents things like bazookas and that from having a real big effect, and stops magnetic mines from sort of sticking to the vehicles. That stops as a factory basis. If troops want to apply it in the field, they can go for it. That's going to be their thing. So the Jagdtiger having the same suspension as the Tiger II is quite handy, but the hull is lengthened, which is why it doesn't happen as quickly as they would like it to. Apart from that, everything is relatively the same as the King Tiger. The positions are the same, the engine is the same, suspension, blah 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 blah. Everything is just the same. The Jagdtiger would only be issued to 2 battalions in its time: the 512th Heavy Panzerjäger Battalion and the 653rd Heavy Panzerjäger Battalion. These would receive their first vehicles in September of 1944, and would record over the time 20% of them being lost in combat, with most being destroyed by their crews. Obviously, the 2 of them used them to varying degrees of success. They were mostly deployed on the Western Front. The 653rd was employed on the Western Front during the Ardennes Offensive. They tried to help slow Patton's assault on Bastogne, which they do help partially in succeeding, but then leave again and just leave the Americans to roll in. The 512th used in the defense of Germany and are involved in actions around the Remagen bridgehead, and are noted to have been employed on the 10th of March 1945 in action around that area. It's obviously, reports are very sketchy. The only definitive sort of real sources we have is from the Tiger is Otto Carius, who commanded the second of 3 companies in Schwerpanzerjägerabteilung 512. His post-war memoir pretty much writes about how awful the vehicle was to try and get into position. The 120mm gun had to be locked down during vehicle manoeuvres, otherwise its mounting brackets would wear out too much for accurate firing afterwards. This meant the crew had to exit the vehicle in combat and unlock the gun from its frontally mounted gun travel lock before firing. In one recorded instance, Carius actually states that a 128mm projectile actually went straight through the house and destroyed an American tank behind the building. The problem at this point with a lot of German vehicles is that a lot of the crews are so poorly trained that they don't take initiatives, and so the Jagdtigers are largely just underperform. And it's a bit of a shame, because they are very, very decent vehicles if they can be used in defensive roles. It is actually known that in fighting around Sagan, one Jagdtiger is actually knocked out by a Volkssturm militiaman who mistakes it for an allied vehicle. So that's not exactly helping themselves, are they? The Jagdtigers are also lost in combat during Operation Nordwood. Actually, they take losses to bazooka infantry, which is weird, because apparently the thing was meant to be invincible to such vehicles. Ultimately, the fates of the 2 Panzerjägers can largely be summed up as roughly the same. 653 is mostly annihilated in constant action, while 512 is surrendered during the rear pocket incident. There is obviously various other companies would fight on until the ultimate destruction of their respective units, but yeah, for the most part, they mostly fail. There are 3 survivors that exist today. One is at the Bovington Tank Museum. One is in the USA. It's at Fort Benning, Georgia. And the last one is at the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow. Okay, this is actually this is the thing about the tanks being so terribly utilised towards the end of the war. There are so many captured as a result. Now, obviously, to sum this up roughly, this vehicle, it's not very good. It's not particularly decent. This is probably one of the worst vehicles we've had on the channel so far. Like I don't rate the Ferdinand a lot of the time. I think it was good in the defensive role. I don't even think you can consider this thing to be good in a defensive role. But yeah, anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.